You may restart, sorry, please.
Okay. So there are five schools of sense making. This is academic references. I've given you one here. There are several others. The one which most people know is Carl Weick, who uses sense making as a neologism, as a noun, really focused with a classic American sociological approach of observing what happens in organizations and deriving theory from those observations. And that's at an organizational level. We've then got a whole group of people, Russell and others, within the IT frame, and I'm going to come back and be fairly cynical about the role of IT and actually AI in knowledge management later. But Russell et al. Really are focusing on derivatives of Shannon's theory of information. It's all about information. It's about algorithms. It's about summarization. And that's a well-established school. You then got Brenda Dervin, who regrettably died last year. She was a really good friend of mine, focused on narrative and various other approaches, but really she came from library science, was her origination, that shows. And then Gary Klein is another good friend who developed the whole concept of how people make decisions based on patterns, working with firefighters and others. And he's got a series of books, all of which are really worth reading. Yeah. My school is called Naturalize, and it takes aspects of all four of those. But sense making we use with a hyphen, so it's a verb, not a noun. That's really important. And I define sense making as how can you make sense of the world so that we can act in it. And with that comes a concept of sufficiency. You never know everything you need to know to make a decision. So what type of decisions can you make based on what you do know? And that's been a driver for my work for some time. Naturalizing comes from philosophy. It means to root what you do in the natural sciences, not in the social sciences. So my background is physics and philosophy. From the point of view of physics, no social scientist or management scientist ever has enough data to form any valid conclusion whatsoever. And I haven't changed my mind on that in 5 decades now. We used to say they suffered from physics envy, which was a deliberate play on words. And you have constant problems with this, the confusion with correlation, the assumption that cases can be replicated. I could give you many examples. We take a different approach. We start by spending 6 or 7 years working within the natural sciences on a subject. Once we've got the theory sorted, then we move into practice. And after we've moved into practice for a bit, then we can move into engineering and rollout. So any method or tool I'm going to talk about today or concept has been through a 10 to 15-year development cycle. It's more like theoretical physics. You start with the maths, you move to the experimental stuff, then you go to engineering. So to give the illustration of why that's important, if you give radiologists a batch of X-rays and ask them to look for anomalies, and on the final X-ray, you put a picture of a gorilla, which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule, 83% of radiologists will not physically see it, even though their eyes scan it. And the 17% who do see it come to believe they were wrong when they talk with the 83% who didn't. It's called inattentional blindness. It's based on the way we make decisions, which is constant micro hallucinations, which entangle themselves with multi-sensory stimulus, some of which we don't yet fully understand, by the way. We now know that scent is really important in trust determination, for example. And once those entanglements form patterns, we carry out a first fit pattern match, not a best fit pattern match. And that's how we make decisions. The concept that we process information in a rational way, the intelligent camera, which actually underpins most knowledge management practice, which is, have you got the right capabilities, the right training? Can we provide the right information? We'll make the right decision, is just really, really bad science. It's not the way it works. Yeah. And if you think about it, that first fit pattern match, it makes sense in evolutionary terms. If you think about the early hominoids on the savannas of Africa, something large and yellow with very sharp teeth runs towards you at high speed. Do you want to artistically scan all available data, look up a catalogue of the flora and fauna of the African veldt, and having identified lion, look at best practice case studies on how to deal with lions? By that time, the only knowledge management document of any use to you would be the book of the book of Jonah from the Old Testament, which is the only example I know of an escape manual from the digestive tract of large carnivore written by a survivor. So we evolved to make decisions very, very quickly based on partial data scans, based on multiple hallucinations and memories. We do not act as a rational, intelligent camera. And that has major consequences for knowledge management practice and everything else. and I'll build on that as I go through. We've just launched a whole process called S-DRIME mapping, which comes from quantum mechanics, and new thinking on dark energy, which focuses on mapping the dispositional states of the system rather than focusing on outcomes. And again, that sort of gives an illustration of our approach. We're saying this is an issue or a problem. This is what the natural science tells us about that. Let's develop methods and tools consistent with that science, and then move them into an experimental stage. So that's naturalizing sense making. On that slide as well, you can see the European Union Field Guide on how to manage complexity in a crisis, a joint publication of Mike and Evans Centre, and also the Future Systems Director to the European Union. Everything I'm going to talk about today is actually in that guide with more material, and that is actually a useful thing because it's an authoritative document from a major, from the European Union itself, which actually describes complexity science and its applications to social systems. So that was kind of like by way of a starting on sense making. Yep. When knowledge management started back in 1995, my history was building decision support systems. So it was kind of like a natural link for me to go into the early stage knowledge management. And I just started a new research role in IBM, and that was the big thing. And I remember knowledge management started based off two frameworks, which I call the models that launched 1,000 failed knowledge management initiatives. One is the data, information, knowledge, wisdom pyramid, which is just bad, right? Fundamentally, knowledge is the way we create information out of data. It's not some higher level order. I can go into that later if you want. But the worst one was the Nagasaki model, which talked about tacit and explicit knowledge. I remember buying it, and I read the first chapter about Western and Eastern philosophy, which was such nonsense. I threw the book in the bin, and then I had to buy it again because it became a bestseller, right? And what's ironic is the book says, Westerners think in categories, Easterners don't, and then it produces a 2x2 categorization matrix, which is fundamental hypocrisy as far as I'm concerned. So that talks about tacit to tacit, socialization, tacit to explicit, externalization. Yeah, you read the stuff, it's internalization, and then you acquire the knowledge. That's called the knowledge creation spiral, the Secchi framework. It misquotes Polanyi, by the way. Polanyi, who created, was probably the originator of the term tacit knowledge, who said no explicit knowledge can ever exist without a tacit component. So the idea that you can make tacit knowledge explicit by codification is fundamentally flawed. We can, by the way, and this is science for you, we can write down less than 10% of what we actually know. So relying on anything which is written is by definition highly restrictive in what it actually does. And I remember the CEO of Hewlett-Packard saying, we need to codify our knowledge because it walks out the door every night. And I and others at that conference said, well, why didn't you focus on getting it to walk back through the door the next day? It might be a lot cheaper. Yeah, and I still stand by that, as a statement. So the Secchi model for me was fundamentally flawed, and that was when I really started to focus on tacit knowledge. And we started then to pick up on something I'll talk about later, which is a quote from Polanyi. We always know more than we can say. And I would extend that to say we can always say more than we can write down. So the process of going from something that we know, and we know it in the brain, the body, and our social environment, to talking about what we know, to writing down what we know, is a progressive series of losses, both of content and of context. And the trouble is the over-focus on explicit knowledge is a problem, in the same way that modern AI people are over-focusing on AI, which can only work with inductive logic, whereas human beings work with abductive logic, and AI just can't do that, right? So similar mistakes have been made in AI as were made in the early days of KM. One of the key things, and this is Guassi's work, if you haven't read Max Brasso's Knowledge Assets, it's one of the classics of the field, his later adventures in iSpace, based on his work at CERN, is probably worth reading. He was my mentor. We spent days and weeks together over the years, at his house in Sirius and elsewhere. And one of the things I took from his iSpace framework is two concepts: abstraction, cost of codification. So this is the next slide. So at the highest level of abstraction, that's where I have a conversation with myself. It used to be the most intelligent audience I had. These days, it may not be so much, and I'm getting worried about that. But fundamentally, I share all of my own knowledge, my education, my experiences, my stories. Therefore, communication is really simple. I've got half a page of notes for this seminar, which none of you could read, which won't make sense to anybody. The cost of codification is very low because the level of abstraction is very high. At the other extreme, if I want everybody to understand what I'm talking about, the cost of codification becomes infinite because I have to share my education, my language, my story, my experience in order to sum what goes on. And within that curve, there's a very narrow range between what's called the upper level of acceptable abstraction and the lower level of acceptable abstraction. Yeah, and this is something which people never bother to work out up front. So they create a community of practice for everybody interested in a field. The trouble is, experts in that field find it trivial, whereas newcomers find it too difficult because they haven't worked out the level of abstraction in advance in terms of the way it works. So kind of like fundamental level one, this was published in the CBI Handbook on Knowledge Management, which I wrote along with some other co-authors, is before you even start a knowledge project, you need to know what is the upper and lower level of acceptable abstraction within different communities. And that will vary radically, yeah, in terms of the way it works. And that's the sort of fundamental process number one. The second thing, Max and I developed this on a tablecloth in Sieges once, all right? They have paper tablecloths, which is really good for academics to have conversations because you can write all over them. So the vertical dimension here is again is abstraction. And now the horizontal dimension is codification, not cost of codification. So the upper right-hand level of that, and the metaphor I'm going to use for this is a map. So a map is highly abstract. It uses highly specialized symbols. If you know the symbols, you can use the map to navigate very effectively. The cost of codification is low and the cost of use is low. So anybody can pick up a map and navigate themselves around the town. So that's the map. Right? At the other extreme, we have the London taxi driver, and I'm deliberately picking London taxi drivers because, as some of you know, it takes at least 2.5 years for them to acquire what is called the knowledge. Okay? Now that's an interesting concept because the way they acquire it is they drive around the streets of London for 1, 2, 3 years with a map of London strapped to the handlebars of a scooter, a motor scooter. And they have to learn the name of every street in London. And the exam is to be given any 2 points in London. And they have to describe the route out and the route back from memory, turn by turn. Yeah, and mention every major landmark on the journey. It has a 40% pass rate over multiple attempts. The minimum time to acquire it is over 2 years because the hippocampus has to physically change its shape in order to accommodate the knowledge. This was one of the first bits of research by which we discovered the role the body actually plays in knowledge. It's not just cognitive. So that gives us 2 extremes, and they have 2 different advantages. The taxi driver is safe, they're trustworthy, they have a profession. You're very unlikely to be sexually assaulted by a London taxi driver, where you have a much higher probability with an ordinary cab. And the reason is that process of professionalization also builds ethics in. They can find their ways instinctively without map consultation. They're very effective, but the cost of creating them is very high because of that training period. On the other hand, the map user, it's very cheap to codify, to create a map, to train people to use a map, but that itself can be dangerous. I once made the mistake of, in New York, of thinking I could get off at 125th Street late at night, walk across 2 blocks, wearing a dinner jacket with a white skin and having an IBM ThinkPad slung over my shoulder, because the map said that was the shortest way home. And the only reason I didn't get mugged, because the police stopped me, was basically they said nobody could believe you were that stupid. And that gave me 10 minutes breathing space. Now, when I told this story next day at Armonk in IBM, they said, didn't you just know you shouldn't do that? It's not safe. I mean, it is actually now very safe, but this is the 90s, right? And I said, how the hell am I meant to know that? And the map doesn't say, here be muggers and other strange beasts. The map says I can walk across 2 blocks between stations and get home faster. So the problem with maps is you have to build so much assumptions about common knowledge and context that they can be very dangerous. And one of the ways I often talked about knowledge, once I'd established that metaphor, was to say, is this a problem for a map or is it a problem for a taxi driver? And by the way, metaphor is one of the primary methods by which we trigger abductive thinking or knowledge transfer in humans. So not is it tacit or is it explicit? Do we need taxi drivers or do we need maps? Because that carries with it sophisticated stories for insight and understanding. And the halfway point between those two is narrative. Yeah, I can tell a story and you will understand the story. Story is the principal mechanism for knowledge transfer in civil engineers. I've done a lot of ethnography with civil engineers. They tell stories. If you're not told the stories, you're not going to survive in that profession, because stories contain highly abstract meaning in a very digestible form. And we're actually now, if you don't know it, using stories for command languages in the US Army. I can go into this later if you want, but if I say little round top, no Chamberlain, I'm using a commonly understood military strategy with a counterfactual. So in 4 words, I can convey a situational assessment in what would otherwise take me 5 pages of writing. So narrative is extremely efficient in conveying knowledge. And also historically, we tend to tell stories of failure, not stories of success, because stories of failure have more learning capacity in them than stories of success. We physically pay more attention to failure than we do to success. And avoidance of failure, as I say, is a more successful strategy. We build worst practice systems for companies. They're more useful than best practice systems. Okay? So that gives me this breakup between knowledge as the taxi driver, which is an apprentice model. It takes time to acquire. It needs experience, training, storytelling, and everything else. And the map user, which is very cheap and easy to put together. And that's also, by the way, where generative AI sits. And the storytelling, which is fundamental to human knowledge communication. All of those need to be in place simultaneously. And we can then do things like narrative enhanced doctrine, which means that we can actually hot link stories into textual documents, which provide richer context and allows people to find things. Yeah? So that's kind of like where we went in knowledge management. We said we need to focus on stories, we need to focus on apprentice models. More than enough people are focusing on codification. That's actually got limited lifespan. We'll focus on the other areas. Yeah, so flipping over the slides again. Yeah. And I'm trying to remember what I was doing on this. Okay. This is where my abstraction notes don't make sense to me either, right? So let me run through some of the sort of narrative-based approaches we've been working. Yeah. What I've got there, I think, is a quote.
I'm not sure. We don't hear him, but he's here. He's here, but we can't hear him anymore. Dave, if you're speaking, we cannot hear you.
That's all right. Sorry about that. I'm back again.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah. So on the left, I've actually got a map to sort of illustrate the point. That's from a walk I did a few weekends ago on Moel Shabbat. I was reliant on explicit knowledge in the form of bus timetables, but also tacit knowledge in terms of people's conversations and my own stories and other people's stories walking on it. So what I want to do there is to go through a series of methods and tools which relate to tacit knowledge capture. The first is build informal networks. So if you want another metaphor for this, tree roots in the forest are basically connected by multiple fungal roots. I'm actually about to hear Merlin Sheldrake at the conference here later. Wonderful book he's written on fungi. The fungal roots are rhizomic and entangled, whereas the tree roots follow straight lines. Yeah, they kind of, it's arbitorial in terms of patterns. What's interesting is the fungal roots can redistribute resources to younger saplings in a forest in times of drought. So they act in a symbiotic way to the actual tree roots. Informal networks in organizations work the same way. If you know somebody, you can get connection to access to people with the capacity to make decisions. And in all the interviews I did of people post-COVID, in COVID, executives fell back to their informal networks because the formal systems weren't designed for COVID or that level of crisis. So building informal networks is key. Singapore government has really dense ones because everybody does national service together. In the UK, they don't because everybody goes to the same limited number of private schools and the same 2 or 3 universities. So the networks aren't distributed enough, which produces perverse results. Now we have 2 methods, which if you run them consistently over 2 years, can mean that everybody is within 2 phone calls of the CEO. If you have an organization like that, it's highly resilient. You're creating the channels through which knowledge will flow rather than trying to codify the knowledge itself. This is a fundamental principle of tacit knowledge, is enable flow rather than trying to codify. So one method we call entangled trios. I'll give you 3 examples of that. We're doing this in IT at the moment. So we put together a young, bright programmer together with an experienced systems analyst, together with a user trained to talk to IT people. It's a lot easier to train users to talk to IT people than it is to train IT people to understand users. If anybody wants to train him, we can share that with you, right? We're also using somebody young and naive with somebody old and experienced, and that's also important. So when we're doing systems and analysts, we throw 15 trios at a problem rather than have one person conduct interviews. Because by the way, if you conduct more than 2 interviews, your brain forms a subconscious hypothesis and you only pay attention to things that match that hypothesis thereafter. So here with multiple trios, with diversity, somebody will see the gorilla. And I'm also building informal networks between IT people and users, which will be really useful as projects proceed. We also do the same thing. People who just joined the company are put in a trio with somebody about to retire from the company, together with somebody on the fast track leadership program who wants to get new ideas to exploit. The people who are about to retire will tell stories to people who have just joined that they will not tell to consultants or middle management. It's called the grandparent syndrome because there's no threat. In government work, we've put teenagers together with people from their grandparents' generation, together with local officials to generate micro ideas for local improvement, which costs significantly less than traditional government programs. Now, those are 3 examples, and the method is fully documented on Cynefin.io, in which we put people together in different combinations, working in parallel to build the informal networks, but also to solve problems. It's listed in the EU field guide as well. We're about to extend that in the NHS in a project I can't talk about yet, but it's got the potential to take 60% of the admin cost out of a hospital by distributing decision-making to groups of 5 roles, of which one of the roles is anonymous, and that's about to start. So this is using people in different combinations in parallel in order to actually use tacit knowledge rather than capture tacit knowledge. Yeah. So we want to make the use of tacit knowledge as easy as possible rather than trying to capture it. The other one is social network stimulation. This is where you announce a series of prizes and rewards. So for example, with one of the big banks, we had, if you could produce, sorry, it is now starting to rain, so I'm covering myself up. We could say basically, if you can produce $20 million of added value benefit for the client, and you can do that by forming a team of 5 people who you've never worked with before, you will get 6 months sabbatical. That's an extremely effective program. Again, it's documented in the wiki. It gives you 3 results. One is it actually solves problems much faster than traditional methods, but it also builds networks across the organization that you can depend on later. So one of the first methods or tools for actually managing that, for managing tacit knowledge, is to build informal networks across the organization. And these days, I would set a KPI for HR people. Network density on the informal side is one of the most important tests for resilience of an organization. Knowledge will flow very quickly when it's needed, yeah, in that sense. The second major area, which I've talked about, is narrative databases. We work with the US Army in Afghanistan. where we basically said to company commanders, I was teaching just war theory at West Point, which is how I got into this. We said to company commanders, if you keep your patrol records in narrative form, because we had real-time human data with human metadata coming in, yeah, which meant we could look at data in real time, rather than waiting for somebody to write a report after the event. We're now doing that in civil engineering in Australia, where we converted engineers over to continuous narrative capture rather than writing project reports, because a narrative contains more data, it comes in real time, and it gives me weak signal detection capability to identify when a project is starting to go wrong. We can also, from that, create massive narrative databases, and we can actually deliberately use things like archetypal characters, you know, Dilbert characters or archetypes, for example, to get people to speculate about how they could fail on projects and tell those stories. We also do that in game environments where we generate multiple stories of failure, and those failures become a database that you can search and serendipitously discover combinations of stories which may apply to your current role or current situation. Yeah. The other thing we started doing now is to create sacred storybooks. We just created one for BMW. So we captured all the stories across the whole of the organization that everybody got excited about. Yeah, and we put them into a book with good designers. And that is now a new type of briefing document for managers. And it's a repository of the culture and learning of the organization. First did that with the US Navy, yeah, in the middle of the Mojave Desert as a briefing paper for company commanders. Leaders will read stories, people will read stories, whereas they won't read a briefing paper. Yeah? So those are a set of methods. And what I want to then do is go on, all right? So this is kind of like slide 4. This is a quote from Alistair MacIntyre, one of the great moral philosophers of the modern age. I actually had the great privilege of studying with him under Herbert McCabe in Blackfriars in the 70s. If you deprive an organization of its stories, I love this phrase, you make children anxious stutterers in their own existence. If you actually remove the storytelling from people and people's interactions, you destroy the humanity of the organization. If you delegate abductive reasoning to AI, you destroy the humanity of an organization. Yeah, so don't underestimate the danger of that. So the approach we developed, and this was originally done with effectively with the US government, a massive DARPA program on counterterrorism before 9/11, where we wanted to see the weak signal detection in street stories, which would indicate a community that was going from tacit to explicit support of terrorism. And the key thing we developed in that is a concept called high abstraction metadata. So if you step onto slide 5, that will illustrate the problem or the solution. You've all, at some stage, I assume, done an employee satisfaction survey. We got them all the time in IBM. And one of the questions we got was, does your manager consult you on a regular basis? Scale of 0, not at all, 10 all the time. And I remember phoning up IBM HR and saying, well, how am I meant to answer this? I've got several managers. Sometimes they consult me, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they should, sometimes they shouldn't. You're asking a context-free question in a context-specific world. That didn't go down very well. The phone was slammed down on me. We take a very different approach. We'll ask you to tell the story you would tell your best friend if they were offered a job in your company. We then ask you to interpret that story onto a series of triangles. And one of the triangles says, in this story, the manager was altruistic, analytical, or assertive. So 3 positive qualities. So you're describing something, not evaluating something. You can't say anything negative, which removes the stress. But then the manager can look at the pattern, and you can see the patterns there, and say, I'm all altruistic, assertive. I'm not analytical. How do I create more stories like this and fewer stories like that? Now, that phrase I've just given you is fundamental to a new theory of change. We've been doing this with nurses, major project for the Royal College of Nurses in the UK. If you say to nurses, how do you make patients more safer and get referred to best practice, they get indignant. If you say, how do we create more patient stories like these and fewer patient stories like those, they can all engage. It's a major change in the way we do things. Really important, by the way, in 360 as an alternative feedback mechanism. It also allows us to effectively create what's called high abstraction metadata. So with 6 triangles, I've got 18 data points. That allows me to draw what are called fitness landscapes, and you see one of those on the right, where I can see a pattern in multiple narratives from multiple agents. I can click on that pattern and I can read the stories. And that's how you enable serendipitous discovery. You're finding things you didn't expect to find, which actually prove more useful instead. Remember, I talked about narrative needs to go with content management. And as I say, those patterns are also, you can say, this is a generic pattern, I need to move in that direction, which is called vector theory of change. One of the things we're just launching, by the way, for measuring ethical attitudes to AI, and also for measuring culture, is we present 6 cartoons. People will choose the cartoon which represents the context in which they're working. They tell a story about why they chose it, they index it, and then we can draw those landscape maps, which basically say this is the pattern of culture in your organization. And this is a key complexity principle. Human beings understand patterns, they don't understand spider diagrams. Spider diagrams have to be explained by a consultant. So we're using narrative effectively as a knowledge repository, and as also as a means of asking people or suggesting change and of creating innovation. In other projects, we've actually, and I'll give this as another illustration, we've captured customer stories and used the high abstraction metadata. We've then codified every engineering part in a major lighting company using the same metadata structure. Then we've mashed the databases together at a metadata level and found that certain technologies are associated with certain customer stories. This is a new type of innovation. And one of the products of that, which I'm actually quite ashamed of, well, not for the money they made from it, but for the product, is a plastic artificial rock which changes lurid colors based on human proximity, water flow, and warmth, which is selling really well in the Far East, which is entirely based on a technology originally designed to handle urine-saturated staircases in Eindhoven football stadium. Now that's true knowledge management, is finding novel applications for things that we're already good at, rather than inventing from scratch. And that's using this key aspect of human ability to know things, is art and language evolved before, art and music evolved before language in human evolution. And we think the reason they developed to the heights of Wagner and Caravaggio is that abstraction allows us to distance ourselves from reality in such a way that we see completely novel connections. And that type of reasoning is called abductive reasoning. And it's a body, social, cognitive process. It's not something which can be codified into algorithms. So to finish off, on the final slide, these are 7 basic rules of knowledge management I formulated some time ago. I've already talked about a few of them. The first is knowledge can only ever be volunteered. It can't be conscripted. You never know whether somebody is sharing their knowledge or not. Yeah.
Can you take off the drawing you added to the screen so we read it better?
No, I can't, I'm afraid. Don't worry about it. I'll sort
so we
that
love
later.
it. It looks very artful, and I'll send the people the clean presentation later.
I'll check the clean one later, and apologies for that. All right. So first of all, knowledge is a voluntary act, it's not conscripted. You never know whether somebody shared their knowledge. When IBM made me share my knowledge on storytelling, in a database in the early days, and linked it to my bonus, and I needed my bonus. I had a teenage daughter at the time, and bonuses are critical to keep teenage daughters happy. I wrote, and I didn't want to share my knowledge, but I wanted to share my knowledge with people who asked me questions, so I understood the context of what they were asking, and I could determine whether they were trustworthy or not. Either way, I had to share my knowledge, so I wrote a 14-page paper on narrative form in postmodernist discourse, which was a fictionalized debate between Deleuze and Habermas, which had more semicolons than full stops, and most words had 8 syllables in them. I still don't understand it to this day, but I'd shared my knowledge, but not in a way that it could be used. And that's actually quite common. So volunteer communities are different from conscript communities. We only know what we need to know when we need to know it. Human knowledge is deeply contextual. It's triggered by circumstances. the phrase "I'll sleep on it" is really important for human beings, whereas if a computer is sleeping something on, you need to reboot it. Yeah. Where people ask questions, very few people will refuse to share knowledge, because if somebody asks a question, then you understand the context and you understand the person, so it's easy to answer it. To codify your knowledge without the question is too difficult and too hard. The point I've also made is that failure is more important than success. Yeah. Also, the way we know things is not the way we remember it. The way we remember what happened changes within 3 or 4 minutes of it happening. Leave it for a lessons learned program or a review program 1 or 2 days later, and politics intrudes far more than reality, which is why we focus on capturing knowledge at the time it happens. Yeah. Then there's the one I talked about. We always know more than we can say. We can always say more than we can write down. And finally, and this is really important for humans, yeah, basically everything in human systems is deeply fragmented. I call it messy coherence. If you want another phrase for that, it's called coherent heterogeneity. So human beings work with fragmented anecdotes, not with structured documents. A storyteller can capture people's attention in a way that somebody reading a document can't. We like to assimilate lots of different anecdotal data and form our conclusion. We don't like to be told what to do. And so that concept of messy coherence is key, and it's the ability to be different. It's why my school of thought completely rejects things like common objectives, common mission statements, common purpose statements, because they tend to homogeneity. And the best way of explaining this, sorry, I'm Welsh. That means rugby is not just a sport, it's a religious matter. I support, like my mother and grandfather before him, supported Cardiff Rugby. We play at the Arms Park. We're a highly civilized rugby team. We never cheat. We always play by the rules. Our spectators are very civilized, and if the other side play well, we cheer them. We're much put upon and abused, but we play in black and blue. Then there are those bastards down the road in Llanelli who play in red. We call them Turks because they hijacked a Turkish ship in the 18th century, killed everyone and stole the goods, and we don't intend to let them forget it. They definitely cheat. It's the only reason why we got a red card the last time we played them. They must have bribed the referee. They can't be trusted. But when the English arrive, we're all Welsh. And that's called coherent heterogeneity. It's the ability to be different in some contexts and to be the same in others. And start to think about an organization not as something that you engineer, which is the basic metaphor of traditional knowledge management, but as a complex ecology where you have to manage and understand interactions. And with that, I've left 15 minutes for questions, which I hope is okay.
Wonderful. We'll open the session to questions. Dear people, it will take a minute or so, but you are all invited to ask some questions. Okay.
You can see a hand up.
Yes, Athontias Christakos, please.
Hi, good to see you, Dave. I have
Hi.
one question based on the last thing you said on the common goals, right?
Yeah.
That we are better able to think in fragmented ways, but it's just so common that we see purpose statements and all these things coming up, and telling them the story about Wales and England might not be what convinces them. What are some of the benefits of keeping things fragmented we can bring up to other stakeholders, etc.?
Dave, did you hear the question? Athonius, can you please repeat?
I think he's frozen again.
Can you please repeat the
This is
question?
coming next. Sorry?
Oh, did you hear the
Can
question?
you please repeat the question slowly and loudly?
Of course. So,
Yeah.
given the last point on how we live in a fragmented world and understand it better of the different situations, since maybe we cannot use the same story you used on England and Wales, but have to show the benefit of keeping some things fragmented and not having one common goal for everything, what are some ways you have talked about it with executives and been able to get that message through to stakeholders?
I've generally found that a sporting metaphor works. You might use football teams in Latin America rather than rugby, unless you're in Argentina. So that's actually quite a good metaphor to get the point across. It's the ability to be different and to be the same with variety. The logical argument I give is if you have a homogeneous a system without differences, it can't evolve and it can't adapt. So if everybody has a common purpose, common goals, and common values, the system lacks sufficient diversity to survive when a crisis hits. That's the most fundamental argument. But there's times when we need to unite and times when we need to be different. And most people at C-level understand that, to be honest. Most senior executives I work with understand the value of 2 competing teams or 3 competing teams on a really difficult problem. They understand the value of difference. Oh, and by the way, the purpose industry is appalling. Next year, you're going to get deep purpose. The book is already out and the consultants will cycle the same methods and repeat the same process with the same value.
Thank you for clarifying, Dave.
Any additional question, please?
There's one in the chat. Do you want to read that, Moria? Or
Yes, I will. Thank you. We have here a question from Victor. Hi, good to hear from you. I read your article into Personal Knowledge Management book, organized by Pauline and Gorman, and there you state you don't believe in personal KM. Can you elaborate more about it? Why do you think? Why don't you think it is personal?
Yeah, that was it. It was more of an interview than an article. Yeah, that was with David, I think, because actually we're social beings. One of the major mistakes, if you go to Northern Europe, North America, and it sort of goes back, to be honest, to the Reformation, is the over-focus on the individual, and with Descartesian dualism, the over-focus on the brain, the separation of the brain from the body. We now know that human consciousness is a distributed function of the brain, the body, and its social interactions. We're more defined by our social interactions than we are by ourselves. So actually, personal knowledge in terms of what you hold in your brain is the wrong way of approaching the problem. What really matters is your interconnectivity in your interactions. And that also matches in with complexity theory, where how things interact is far more influence in changing things than changing people. So it's why, for example, and I'll do the standard pitch on this, talking about mental models, whereas it might have been a cute idea in the 1980s, is really, really bad science. Yeah, we are not an intelligent camera. Yeah, we do not have mental models. Computers do, we don't. Yeah. Fundamentally, human decision-making is that interaction, that entanglement of memories, hallucinations with signals, and that first fit pattern match approach. So the richer your social interactions, the more effective you are. And we actually are really bad as individual decision makers, but we're really good as collective decision makers in extended families, sexual pairs, and clans, but not in bigger groups. So the focus on interaction is far more important than the focus on the individual.
Thank you. Next question will come from Sven. Sven, can you please speak up?
Yeah, Dave, here are the courses on tacit knowledge, right? The value of tacit knowledge. And one of the things that we discuss within my organization a bit is which approach to take in what situation and context in terms of knowledge transfer, be it through training, be it through more social learning avenues, be it through experiential knowledge or sort of learning on the job and so on. Would you care to maybe say your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so we have another framework called ASHEN, which is a mnemonic. It stands for artifact, skills, heuristics, experience, and natural talent. Yeah, so artifacts are things which are man-made, like computers and databases. Skills are things which you can train people to do because you know what a successful, you know what skill acquisition means and you can test it. Yeah. Heuristics or habits. Habits are a massive energy reduction capability in humans. So we build habitual behavior. Australians don't allow children to drive cars with other than elderly parents for 2 years after they pass their test, because they won't have developed the habits that allow them to drive and pay attention to a conversation. So habits are really important, and they generally tend to be experiential. Yeah, and also they can be captured in story. And experience is key, all right? And some people are just better at doing things than other things. So the more the knowledge focuses towards habits, experience, and natural talent, the more you need to invest in experiential learning apprenticeship systems, and also in building distributed decision processes rather than delegated ones. The more you're focused on artifacts and skills, if I'm being brutally honest about this, I've yet to see anything at any knowledge management conference which didn't just stop at artifacts and skills. It never really understood tacit knowledge, and it still hasn't to a large extent. So that would be one aspect. I think the other thing I would start to focus on is starting to stimulate the system and respond to patterns. This is actually modern complexity economics. In traditional economics, you build a model and you try and work out which model is the most accurate, has got the predictive capacity. In complexity theory, you don't that. You simulate at scale, you identify patterns, then you use models to explain the patterns to discover which is a hallucination and which isn't. That's a major switch going on in economics at the moment, and it actually produces better accuracy. What we do with the narrative databases is we simulate what knowledge exists in the organization at a micro level. Then we respond to the patterns in that rather than trying to decide upfront what knowledge we want. And that, again, is a radical change in the way you do the work.
Thank you. I think that the last question comes from Monica on the chat. Thank you very much for the presentation and for the ideas. But she's speaking about a concern that worries her as to knowledge leakage when experts leave the organization, and asks for your recommendations how to mitigate this leak.
Okay, so first of all, you need to hold knowledge in collective groups of people, not individuals. Yeah, no expert should be working without a couple of assistants or junior people in training. That apprentice model is key. And part of the problem with the drive for efficiency in organizations is people have removed apprentices or junior trainees from the system. So the more expertise you've got, the more you need that to be in role combinations. The second thing is people will tell stories are a faster way of getting knowledge from experts than text. So we've done that work. So for example, we've taken doctors who've recently graduated and got them to follow consultants, 20-year experience consultants around for a week. They've captured more knowledge doing that than anybody has ever got from senior consultants before. Yeah, because they're capturing knowledge in context, it's in story, they're young, they're naive, they ask different questions. I did one in the North Sea where we put engineering students to shadow engineers on the oil rigs for a month. Everybody benefited from that, including they worked out which engineers they wanted to recruit. But the narrative database we collected from that had far more data than anybody had achieved through codification, because it was a naturalistic approach to capture, and it actually handled it and held it in narrative form. Often it's easier to take a picture than write something down, which we allow. So those are the sort of things I do. You focus on holding knowledge collectively, not individually. You focus on increasing the interactions between people, which, by the way, will also increase retention. Yeah, if people work in tight teams who they respect, they'll be less likely to go.
Okay, last question. Antonio, please do it short, and we want to end the session.
Of course. Thank you, Maria. So, Dave, when you talk about the narratives, how much guidance would you give to people that are supposed to put narratives in, and how much guidance would you give to people that are supposed to read through them?
As little as possible. All right. So the key thing is metadata. So if you read stories, after 3 or 4 stories, you'll have formed an opinion and you will read the other stories in that light. So we don't want that. So what we do, I showed you some metadata patterns earlier, like the landscape. And what we're doing is we're saying numbers are objective but not persuasive. Stories are persuasive but not objective. So you capture data in the field and people place the data into those quantitative frameworks. So this is a quant or mixed method technique. You then look for statistical patterns and then you use the stories to explain those statistical patterns. It's also, by the way, links in with a key issue in the feminist literature, which is epistemic justice, which is you should have the right to interpret your own experience, not have it interpreted by a computer algorithm or by an expert. And the origination of the software for this, by the way, was to create epistemically balanced training data sets for the intelligence communities in the US. Because to be quite honest, in terms of AI, the algorithms are the easy bit. You can just throw more computing power. What really matters is what you train the things on. And nobody should be building any AI without conscious and deliberate attention to the training data sets. Black box AI is really dangerous. So narrative is persuasive, numbers are objective, combine the two, allow search through statistical patterns, use narrative as explanation. That's kind of like key.
Thank you. Dave, thank you for a fabulous session. I can say for myself that I learned a few things, indeed. And have fun in your festival. Drink a lot of beer or whatever you have there. And maybe
Gonna go and dry out now.
Meet very closely in Dublin. Have a great day.
Oh,
Bye.
yeah. Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you.
And
Bye-bye.
thank you for joining us today. And we will see you next week. As I said, I will be sending you out a recording. Thank you and bye all.
Bye-bye.